The trial and execution of Charles I, January 1649. In the Middle Ages, many English kings had been disposed of violently, and not a few on the continent. And then, in the 1590s, the fate of these kings was written up by Marlowe and Shakespeare. We can give plenty of examples. Marlowe's Edward VII. Sorry, my mistake. Marlowe's Edward II, murdered in a horrible way in 1327. Shakespeare wrote about Richard II, murdered 1400 maybe. Henry VI, also written by Shakespeare, murdered after capture in the Battle of Tewkesbury, after being captured. Then Richard III, not so much directly murdered as killed in hot blood on the battlefield of Bosworth, 1485. The very tragic, pathetic fate of the two boys, King Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, who were possibly murdered by Richard III so he could seize the throne. He was their uncle, which means that if that was the case, Richard III got his comeuppance 2 years later. Then the first Tudor king who benefited, Henry VII, didn't get a comeuppance, died in bed in 1509, a bit fearful. Mind you, if he was the one who had murdered the boy King Edward V and his brother, then perhaps he deserved a comeuppance, but anyway, he didn't get one. What I've said is that in the Middle Ages, it was no unusual event for kings to die a violent death. As Shakespeare said, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. So what was new about the trial and execution of Charles I in 1649? Well, medieval regicides were hole-in-the-corner affairs, shamefaced. Essentially, what had happened is a new monarch, maybe the son or cousin or whatever of the unsuccessful deposed monarch, had seized the throne, and obviously you just couldn't allow the deposed one to live, because there'd be a revulsion in his favour and he'd make a comeback. You had to kill him if you wanted to carry on being king yourself. So the poor chaps were usually deposed of, done away with in some cell somewhere, or rather nasty. The nastiest death was rumoured to be that of Edward II in 1327, the precise circumstances of which I won't go into. And then fake stories were given out that the king had died naturally, or died of despair or something, the imprisoned king. Rather nobler, at least, was Richard III's death in battle. But Charles's execution came after a very long period, over 150 years, when all that was supposed to be behind us. The Tudors naturally taught that it was very much behind us. They had a great interest in doing so. They pushed the idea that the monarch was sacrosanct, indeed the representative of God on earth, which was all the easier to do when England became Protestant, so that you didn't have the Pope as a rival for that role. And indeed that the monarch was a sort of lay Pope, God's anointed. And this had been hammered remorselessly in from the time of Henry VII, who didn't have too much claim to be God on earth. He was a talented chancellor, who managed to grab the throne by luck, Bosworth Field, we just dealt with, hammered in remorselessly from his time in the 1480s to Charles I's own time in the 1630s. The only problem is, it seemed to work for the Tudors. It obviously didn't work for Charles, and that's the surprising thing. Then came, after all this propaganda, there came the civil war against the king, culminating in this open public example. And it was a new sort of regicide. Cromwell said the organiser and leader, the man who made it all possible, was Oliver Cromwell, the general of the New Model Army, who was really the most powerful man in the kingdom, if you can still call it a kingdom, by 1649. And Cromwell said, "We will cut off the king's head with the crown on it. It will be open and public." The monarch himself and the whole institution of monarchy was put on trial. This is a rather modern idea. It looks to the future. Little to do with sordid medieval assassinations. And in fact, Charles's trial parallels the Nuremberg war crimes trials of 1945 in some ways, or the trials now being rather unsuccessfully mounted in theory of various Balkan cutthroats, just as I speak. The king was accused of abuse of office, betrayal of responsibilities, of making war on his own people. He was condemned to death on those grounds. Charles Stuart, condemned to death as Charles Stuart, King of England. No fiction that he'd abdicated or anything like that. So he'd be killed as a private man. And this was a savage early contribution to democratic accountability, the idea that a ruler could be called to account, deposed and punished. It was also, at a less exalted level, a political party move. Cromwell, the militarists and extreme republicans, wanted to show there was no going back to a monarchy. This didn't work because it merely passed on Charles's claims to his 19-year-old son, who hadn't offended anybody and was a young, good-looking and dashing lad in exile beyond the clutches of the Cromwellian party. Against this, the king argued the divine right position of monarchy, and he argued it very well. The idea that the king had been put in his position by God and was accountable only to God. Charles behaved extremely well at his trial. He argued a very good case. He knew a lot of law, and he did it himself. It shows that Charles was a lousy, useless politician, in a way, otherwise he wouldn't have got in this position, but a clever and cultivated man. The only problem is all this was futile. No one was very interested, at the time anyway, no one was very interested in hearing him, and he duly got executed. And we all know, or lots of British people know, the hieratic scenes, the ceremony of the execution at Whitehall. So England had the first revolutionary republic in Europe ever. The Dutch case, 70 years earlier, is a somewhat different thing. And followed reluctantly by Scotland, who abolished the monarchy a few months later. And this sets the example for the execution of Louis XVI of France in 1793, and for that of the Tsar Nicholas and his family in 1918, although there was no trial of Tsar Nicholas. It was more like old-fashioned medieval-style murder, but then that's Russia for you. But, in fact, the trial and execution of Charles did not have popular support. It was the work of a faction who were powerful because they were the new model army, but they were too radical for the vast majority of English and certainly Welsh people. The Welsh, by the way, were very royalist. When news of the execution of the king got about, pregnant young women had spontaneous abortions, and aging men dropped down dead of a stroke on the spot, even though they were not expected to die there and then. The shock was too much, and these are well authenticated. Secondly, the king behaved in an exemplary fashion personally, both on the trial and at the scene of his execution. He even requested 2 vests for this cold January day, because he said, I don't want to shiver with cold in case onlookers think I'm shivering with fear. It's not the way for a king to die. And the Anglicans, of course, then canonise him as St. Charles the Martyr. In St. Mary Magdalene Church in Oxford, a commemorative service of St. Charles the Martyr is held every 30th of January on the commemoration of his execution, and you can see his image with candles round any time you go into the church. So it could be argued that England's revolution, or revolutionary phase, came too early. It was premature. It ended in a compromise 1660 when Charles II gets back, and it actually saved the monarchy in a constitutional form. The monarchy is, after all, still here today.